they still have to deal with this fact that the Old Testament talks about God appearing in human form and predicts that he would come in the future in human form. And the reason they have to deal with this is because these things were written prior to the coming of Christ. Even if you want to say the Old Testament was corrupted, notice the colossal problem that this puts in your lap. It's already a problem if the Old Testament is intact, what was written remained the way it was written, and it predicts these things, right? As a Muslim, you've got a huge problem if that's the case. That's why they have to say it's been corrupted. But notice how silly your religion ends up looking and your objections to Christianity end up looking. If you now, in order to get rid of the force of these Old Testament predictions, you say they're all the result of a corruption. So Christianity ends up being accurately predicted by the Old Testament as a result of human corruption? Really? So, I mean, in other words, you're saying that this collection of writings in the Old Testament has hundreds of predictions that are fulfilled in the historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth by means of human. Do human beings have this kind of remarkable ability through corrupting a text to make it a wondrous display of future realities the way that it is? I mean, I barely scratched the surface, and I can assure you the Old Testament scriptures speak to Christ over and over again. In fact, as I've demonstrated on other occasions, sometimes the Old Testament picture of what Jesus would say and do is more graphic, more vivid than the New Testament itself. Go read, for example, Psalm 22 or Isaiah 53. Both of those texts are far more descriptive of what Christ endured on the cross than anything you'll get in the Gospels or the writings of Paul. They're far more vivid in their description. It's remarkable. So much so that I've quoted these passages to Jews without telling them where they came from, so that if they're not familiar with them being part of the Old Testament, I've read them to them, and their natural response was to say, we don't believe those things that Christians teach, right? We don't accept those things. And then I point out to them, these aren't part of the New Testament, they're part of the Old Testament. So you're objecting to these teachings right there in the Old Testament, and you're testifying against yourself, saying this is how you understand these texts as well.